is challenging 16-year incumbent Democrat Richard Conlin for Seattle City Council position. Sawant is an economics teacher at Seattle Central Community College and a member of the American Federation of Teachers Local 1789. She was an activist in the Occupy Wall Street movement and is a fighter for workers, women, LGBTQ people, and immigrants. In 2012, Sawant won a historic 29% with over 20,000 votes as a socialist alternative candidate against Democratic Washington State House Speaker Frank Chop, the strongest vote for an independent left-wing candidate in U.S. history, and the highest vote for a socialist in decades. And this paragraph you will find from her website. And so let's give a round of applause first. Now let me introduce Councilman Richard Conlin. Richard Conlin is honored to have served 2 terms as council president from 2008 to 2011, and is excited to take on new challenges in 2012 and 2013 as chair of the Planning, Land Use, and Sustainability Plus Committee. His work is guided by the comprehensive plan principles of economic opportunity, environmental stewardship, social justice, and community. He welcomes your input on policy ideas and on how we can make a better Seattle. This bio is also from his website. Let's give a round of applause to Councilman Richard Conlin. Now we're going to ask each of the candidates to give us their opening statement. We're going to first ask Councilman Conlin to give his. He has 3 minutes.
All right, thank you all for being here. It's great to have the opportunity to be here and see you all, and thanks to those who organized this and put it together. I come to the City Council with a background in community activism. I was one of the founders of an organization called Sustainable Seattle, which was the first organization, in fact, in pretty close to the world, to put sustainability on the public policy agenda for the cities and countries around the world. We pioneered some of the things that are now being adopted commonly all around the world in sustainable development. I also was, just to give you another piece of background, I was also one of the founders of BikeWorks. I don't know how many are familiar with that, but it's an organization in Columbia City that works to provide bikes to young people, to get them engaged in biking and get them started in doing bicycling and alternative transportation. I was involved in my community council and neighborhood planning in the city, and then decided to run for city council in order to try and see what I could do to make a difference for the city. I'm going to give you an example. I have a long track record of things that I've accomplished and things that I'm working on, but I'm going to give you an example of the kind of things that I've been able to do that are going to make a difference in your lives. You all can look out here and see where the light rail station is going to be built, or is being built right now. It's going to open in the not too distant future, in the next couple of years. One of the things that happened around that light rail station was that Sound Transit bought a bunch of property around the station because they needed it to construct the station for staging and so forth. I worked with the community, a group called the Capitol Hill Champion, which was a combination of the chamber and the community council, to put together a plan for what the community could get out of that land that Sound Transit currently occupies when the station is completed and goes online. And what we did was negotiate a development agreement. A development agreement that provides that there is going to be housing, jobs, opportunities, businesses, lots of other things on that site when Sound Transit is ready to release that site to the community. And it's also going to be built with a required affordable housing component. 36% of the housing units are going to be required to be affordable, which is actually our comprehensive plan goal. Our comprehensive plan goal is 38% of all the housing units to be available to those making 80% or less of median. There's also going to be the opportunity for an LGBTQ community center, That's something that people are working on and that may be a possibility there. There's going to be Central Plaza, where a farmer's market, the current farmer's market that's right out here, is going to have a permanent home. So we'll be able to continue to bring fresh produce into the community and give people the opportunity to make things happen with that. And one of the things that's important about the farmer's market, and something that I was able to accomplish in the last year, is we have a program called Fresh Bucks. And Fresh Bucks provides that if you're on food stamps, if you've got an EBT, you can get your value of that doubled at the farmer's markets. I got the city to put money into that to make it happen. We piloted it last year, expanded it to all our markets this year, and we're going to have it as a permanent part of our system in the future. Those are the kind of things that I do. Lots of other things I can talk about. I look forward to the opportunity to talk about more details. Thank you.
Thank you for having me here. I'm happy to speak in my place of work, the best place I've ever worked. And I wanted to start by talking about this headline in the Seattle Times. The federal government shutdown has ended, but even the conservative Seattle Times asks, for how long? The disaster has been averted for now, but how many times are we to be held hostage? 60% of Americans now say the Democratic and Republican parties do such a poor job of representing the American people that a third major party is needed. And this deep disappointment and disapproval is not just at Washington, D.C., it's happening at the local level as well. We live in a state with the most regressive tax system in the entire nation. King County Metro bus service faces 17% cuts, devastating. Cuts to public education have been deep, as you well know. Student debt is a blight on young people's lives. And all this while corporations are making historically high profits and the richest have grown richer. The poll released by King 5 earlier this week shows that 45% of the people surveyed disapprove of the Seattle City Council, and that accounts for 54% who identify as independent. And the reason is clear. Seattle is becoming an increasingly unaffordable place to live for most of us. Many of the city's workers are among the working poor. The youth, many of the youth are going to join the ranks of the working poor. The gender pay gap in the metropolitan area is one of the worst in the country. Rent is rising faster in Seattle than any other metro area in the US, and young and low-income people of color are increasingly being forced out of city limits. The city government, exemplified by 16-year incumbent Richard Conlin, has overseen decades of displacement, systematic gentrification, increased homelessness, deterioration in mass transit, and an increased loss of existing low-income housing. Conlin was the only council member who voted against paid sick days for Seattle's workers. He has also stated that he does not support a citywide $15 an hour minimum wage. He pushed for a bill to criminalize the homeless. He presided over the South Lake Union land giveaway to rich developers and Amazon.com. I'm campaigning for a citywide $15 an hour minimum wage. I'm calling for a citywide tax on millionaires to fund mass transit and public education. I'm also calling for rent control and other measures to address the crisis in affordable housing in the city. I'm also running to help empower working people, the youth, women, and people of color to take on political leadership and to represent the interests of the 99%. We need to reject the status quo where big business calls the shots and expects us to look the other way as poverty and inequality increase. The response to our grassroots campaign has been phenomenal, and its success in already changing the political debate in the city shows that it is possible for ordinary people to be the real drivers of social change. Thank you.
We don't want Seattle to be like the other Washington. Washington, D.C. is a disaster area. But it's not a disaster area because the Democrats and the Republicans stand for the same thing. It's a disaster area because we have a Republican Party that has made a decision that it is more interested in destroying the government than in helping people. I stand proudly with the Democratic Party and with President Obama and the Democrats in Congress who stood up for Social Security, for Medicare, for all of the things that we need to have in order to have the right kind of a society for the future. And that's what we're doing in Seattle. We're working to create the society that's going to work for the future. We have a transit system now that we're developing. We've got light rail that's being built here. It's going to UW. It's funded to Northgate and Linwood. We've got it going to the east side, across to Bellevue and Redmond. We've got it going south from the airport. We've got plans and work that's underway in order to make this happen. We've got an affordable housing strategy that we'll talk about a little bit later that is going to help provide affordable housing for everybody. Here's some of the problems. Ms. Sawant talks about things like rent control and the millionaire's tax. As she knows, rent control, whether it's a good thing or not, because there's some issues with rent control, but it was prohibited by the state legislature in 1982. We can't do rent control as a city council. It's a cruel illusion to tell you that rent control is going to control your rents. Even if somehow something happened at the state legislative level, that's going to take years before that can be accomplished. Similarly with the millionaire's tax, we don't have the authority to do anything like that. That's something that the people voted down, actually, unfortunately, a graduated income tax in this state. I'd like to see that happen. Can't happen in the city.
Unfortunately, there is so much there that needs response. I'm going to be able to address only part of it. Mr. Conlin is right. Washington, D.C. is a disaster because there is actually a distinction between what Republicans stand for and what Democrats stand for. The problem in Seattle is that it is a one-party city. It is run by the Democratic Party establishment, and that's exactly the problem. The problem is that there is too much homogeneity of opinion on the city council. Nobody's fighting for ordinary people. They all agree that they should represent big business interests. But that is not a better situation, that is a worse situation in a way, because that is the cruel illusion that it promotes, that somehow because most of the city council members are in agreement that politics is working. Politics is not working for most of us. And in terms of the laws that he's talking about, we can't do rent control, we can't do millionaire's tax, we can't change the business tax code. His eagerness, his paralysis in fighting for our interests is matched only by his eagerness to represent the interests of big business. Look how he pushed the tunnel. Things move fast because money talks. So if you're wealthy, things move fast for you on the city council, and that is precisely what we are trying to change. We are trying to bring a democratic voice into the city council so that we can actually do these things. And as far as these laws that exist, if a law is unjust, it is our duty to challenge it. That is how marriage equality was achieved. That is how civil rights was achieved. And that is what our duty is today. And it's dishonest to say that, well, we can't do this. Well, maybe you can't do it, but we can and we must.
Well, we're off to a robust start. And now what we want to do is to pose questions to the candidate that we've asked them to respond to. And I'm going to ask this time for Professor Sawant to respond first. She will have 2 minutes. And here's the question. Over the past several years, Seattle has been considered one of the most sustainable and livable cities in the United States. What steps could the City Council take to implement policies that ensure that Seattle stays on top as America's most sustainable city?
Thank you for this very important question. And in terms of the sustainability issues, one of the most looming challenges that we face is the crisis of climate change, which needs to be dealt with urgently. Here, obviously this is a global issue, but here in Washington State and in Seattle, we have a particular issue to think about, which is the impending Cherry Point terminal, coal terminal that will be built in Bellingham unless you and I, we stop it. One study from Greenpeace found that it would be one of the 7 worst projects for climate change in the world. And the Seattle Department of Transportation study found that traffic in Seattle would increase by 3 hours, 1 to 3 hours per day. This is a major thing that we have to prevent from happening. But to understand how to prevent it, we have to think about the politics behind it. Who is behind the coal trains? It's corporations, mega corporations like BNSF, from whom Mr. Conlin has taken maximum contributions, and it's also financial giants like Goldman Sachs who, engineered the financial collapse. Preventing this coal terminal is not going to be that easy. We will have to, first start by banning coal trains. Again, Mr. Conlin will predictably tell you that that can't be done, but, of course it can be done. However, that will not be enough. We will need to organize mass, non-violent civil disobedience against coal trains, and that is what we should be talking about. But outside of coal trains, transit is a serious issue, and Seattle's traffic congestion, for all the achievements that Mr. Conlin is lauding for himself, Seattle's traffic congestion is the 8th worst in the U.S., and it grew more than a national average since June. 81% of Seattleites are still driving to work. We are fully in support of light rail, but the reality is that the light rail, the way it is being planned, is going to service 3 to 5% of the population. The majority of the population is not going to be serviced because they are getting pushed out of the city because they can't afford to live here. So these problems are interrelated, and we have to talk about it in that form. But to begin with, at least we have to talk about a tax on millionaires to fund mass transit in a permanent way.
Well, I'm pleased to see the acknowledgement of how significant and important climate change is. It's something I've been working on in all my time on the council. In the year 2000, the city of Seattle became the first city in the country to take a formal position in support of the Kyoto Protocol, the first attempt to try and challenge carbon emissions around the country. 4 years ago, under my leadership as council president, we adopted a plan to be climate neutral for the city of Seattle. This is the first city in the country to do that. We've got a strategy that we're pulling together and making happen, and we have the opportunity to really be, again, the leader to help challenge climate change. It is incredibly important. As a member of the Leadership Alliance Against Coal, as a matter of fact, a founding member of the Leadership Alliance Against Coal, I will be representing the city at the hearing in Tacoma tonight and helping to work on the ways in which we can pull together local officials to challenge the coal train through every legal and political means possible, and we are quite confident that we're going to win. I don't have any doubt about it, in fact. If we talk about the city, though, there's a lot more that we need to think about that's going to make the city continue to be livable and sustainable in the future. The city of Detroit in the 1950s had the highest household income of any city in the country. Think about that. Think about what Detroit is today. We are very fortunate in Seattle that we have jobs and housing and thousands of people who are coming here because they want to live in Seattle, because we have done a pretty good job of creating a city that really works. But we can't take that for granted. And we can't take it for granted that we are going to have a city that works for everybody. It doesn't. There are lots of people who need assistance. I led the council in making sure that we maintained every single human service program in our budget during the times of the recession when we were cutting tens of millions of dollars out of our budget. And I sponsored adding additional programs, emergency food, domestic violence, assistance for domestic violence victims, for housing, a special program to help refugee women who are victims of domestic violence because they have special needs and interests for legal assistance because of fears about their immigration status. Those are the kind of things we need to do in order to keep Seattle sustainable for the future.
So I just wanted to say that, first of all, that it's important to look at the details of the climate action plan that Mr. Conlin is touting. The city has put out a 92 or a 98-page PDF document that, climate action plan, and it looks really nice. It has really nice graphs. But the two phrases that it does not mention are mass transit and coal trains. These are two very, very important, probably the most important issues that we need to focus on if we are truly to live up to this reputation of being sustainable and livable. And as far as what has been accomplished in the decade and a half of Mr. Conlin's career, I think, of course, it's true he has done some things. He has passed laws for pygmy goats in the backyards of people. He has passed, he has made pea patches possible. He has made fresh produce possible, for a small number of households through the Fresh Bucks program. We support all these things. The point is, How low are we going to set the bar to decide what is a sustainable city and what the city council should be doing for our city? For all the small little programs that the city has done, vast numbers of people go without nutritious food, and Seattle metropolitan area has been identified as one of the, this is a dubious distinction, one of the cities with some of the largest food deserts, meaning, vast neighborhoods where people don't have access to food because they live in neighborhoods that are not serviced, and because they have such low wages that they can't actually afford good food other than just fast food. And I think that if we are to talk about sustainability, then we have to talk about the fact that a majority of the city is now being pushed out of the city limits. Mr. Conlin has also famously said that the city center is too hot for low-income people to live in, and people are being pushed 2 and 3 bus transfers away from their place of work. That is not a sustainability plan.
I'm surprised at some of the words she puts in my mouth. It's things that I've never heard of before. I was named by Food Lifeline as Hunger Fighter of the Year for this year, for my work to challenge hunger. We have a strategy that we put together with the United Way, to put together a complete program to make sure that we actually have the resources that we need in order to make sure that we get all of the not only food, all kinds of food, but good nutritious food out to everybody in our community. Lots of things that we're doing on that. And that's an important part of being able to take care of the situations that we need to deal with in our society. The fact is, sustainability does require a lot more than that. We need to challenge hunger. We need to make sure that we have housing for people. We need to make sure we have jobs for people and good jobs for people. Those are the other things that are important to have happen. And that means providing job training and assistance. It means making sure that we have a business climate that's going to be successful, so that when you want to start a small business, you have the opportunity to actually make things happen. 30 seconds? Okay. Yeah, so for example, one of the things that I've been able to do, one of the restaurants are one of the places where people often think about starting new businesses. And it's particularly important in immigrant and refugee communities, where this is often one of the best ways in which people can get started in the business community. Turns out there are 4 different governmental entities that you have to get a permit from in order to get a restaurant. Nobody had coordinated these things. I pulled them together. We started a process. We're moving towards a one-stop permitting system for restaurants, so that we can actually have people come in, not have to navigate the incredible bureaucracy that they have to navigate right now, but actually get it happen so that they can go on the street and get their business started as soon as possible. That's the sort of thing we need to have as part of an overall strategy for making Seattle more sustainable.
Our next question shifts from discussing the environment and sustainability to matters of race and policing. Over the past few years, there has been an escalation of police violence, and the United States Justice Department did an investigation and determined that, in their opinion, Seattle's policing in terms of violence was unconstitutional. And they selected a judge to oversee reforms in the city of Seattle with the work of the mayor and the city council office. Thanks for turning the light back on. And that policing has been especially violent towards people of color, of darker color. We're all people of color. White is a color. But people of darker color. What would you do to address this? And I want to start this time with Councilperson Conlin. 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is an extraordinarily important part of city government and an important part of an issue that we need to address. It is a disgrace that Seattle is under a Department of Justice mandate to reform. And frankly, things should have been done in the past that would have made it better now. But now is the opportunity. Thankfully, the Department of Justice has given us a mandate and a direction for what it is that needs to be done. My diagnosis of the issue that we've had with our police department is fundamentally a lack of management, training, and policy approaches that give the police on the street the direction that they need to have in order to be successful. We actually have lots of great police officers in this city. Most of them do very well, they work hard, they take care of people, they maintain public safety, and they don't engage in the practices that we're talking about here. But there are enough that have caused a significant problem that we need to take care of that. So here's what we need to do. Number one, new management. Management that is going to be responsive and responsible and make sure that things happen in a different way. Number two, a set of new regulations and policies, which is what the Department of Justice is calling on us to do, and those are being developed at a steady pace, and we are going to be implementing them over the next few months. Thirdly, the Community Police Commission, which has been created as part of that, is going to continue to be in existence and give us advice and assistance in trying to work out how those policies are going to happen. And finally, we need to make sure that when people are actually committing the crimes that we're talking about, which are crimes against the public, that those people need to be punished and have consequences for them. And there is the possibility of making this happen. We look at the terrible situation that happened with John Williams, for example. That was a young cop who was on the street without supervision. He came into, when they investigated, the police department themselves investigated what he had done, and they said he had done 4 different things that he should never have done under the proper protocols. That's a lack of management. And that's what needs to be changed in our police department in order to make it better.
I'm really glad this question is being asked. This is so relevant for everybody who cares about social justice, but especially for the people who are targeted, which is people of color and low-income people and the homeless. The SPD has a long and notorious record of abusive, repressive, and racially biased actions, and it's not new. It's a systematic thing that has been going on for decades, and the investigation that Carl mentioned found that 1 in 5 uses of force by the SPD violated constitutional procedures, and half of those cases involved people of color. This is a systematic process of discrimination and targeting of people of color. And I'm glad that Mr. Conlin mentioned the absolutely heinous crime of the shooting of First Nations woodcarver John T. Williams. But the question here is about leadership on the city government. Did Mr. Conlin stand up on the podium, call a press conference and say, I condemn this and we need to stop this. Let's get people of color together. Let's get all the people in the city together. Let's have massive town halls. Let's have a democratic discussion about what needs to be done. And what needs to be done is a major overhaul of what's happening in this city. And he calls it a problem of management, and that's partly true. But the reality is that this is the elephant in the room, the underlying racism, sexism, homophobia that exists in society. And if you want leadership in the city government, we want leaders to be talking about these unspoken things. And that is absolutely central to this question. There's many concrete things we can be doing, but look at what's happening even after the DOJ report was released. The city council showed itself completely unwilling to rein in SPD abuse of power. In March of this year, council members, including Richard Conlin, exempted the SPD from even a minimal process of public inquiry before acquiring drones. I don't know how many here aren't shuddering at the thought of the SPD having access to drones. Giving carte blanche to the SPD for the use of drones is like handing a club to a bully. And I will have more to say later.
It's odd that people would mention that drone policy because it is one of the most far-reaching and, I think, progressive policies that any city has adopted. That we have actually said we're not going to allow you to get drones or use drones except when you come to the council, get approval, get authority, and actually we know what the mission is going to be and we know exactly what's going to happen. And we told them they had to give back the drones that they had already gotten from the federal government. So I actually think we're pretty much on top of that. But let me turn to the most important thing that we're talking about here, and that is race and social justice. The city has a race and social justice initiative. We understand the issues of institutional racism. We understand the issues that people deal with of white privilege and the other things that we need to address as part of our institutional structure in this city. And we are consequently doing, within the city, race and social justice trainings, for everybody in the city, not just people in the police department, we're working on them as well, but everybody in the city is going through race and social justice training, making sure that people understand not only the fact that all of us consciously say we're not racist, but the fact that there are unconscious things we do and act on that can often have untoward consequences because of that institutionalized racism. So this is an important strategy that we began a few years ago. It's been accelerated over the last several years, and the police department gives us another great reason for making sure that we continue to do this. And most importantly about this, one of the things that we looked at was overhauling our participation models for how do we get people engaged and involved in city government. And our models often traditionally have said, oh, well, come to our meetings and we'll talk to you about it, and you can talk to us and we can hear from you. But in a lot of cases, people are not necessarily comfortable coming to city meetings. And that's not the way in which they necessarily are used to dealing with things in their community. So one of the things that we've pioneered as part of this, as part of the update of our neighborhood planning program, is to go out to people in the communities, going to the churches, going to the community organizations, going to people in their own places, and making sure that they have the opportunity to talk when they feel comfortable, when they feel safe, and we have the opportunity to listen and come up with ways and strategies in which we can make things better. Thank you.
So obviously these questions, these issues run deep, and I don't think we can solve this problem purely by policy measures, but I do want to outline several policy measures that will make a difference. But I wanted to start by saying that at the end of the day, these issues of racism and police brutality tie very closely with the underlying poverty, inequality, and income and race segregation in our community. And those are the issues that we need to address eventually. But in terms of immediate tasks on police brutality, I think first we need a democratically elected civilian oversight committee with full hiring, firing, and subpoena powers over the SPD. The SPD needs to be accountable to us, the community, not to the city government, which has utterly failed in holding it accountable. There are many other measures. Breaking the code of silence, requiring officers to report on criminal wrongdoing by other officers, and then protecting the reporting officers from retaliation. Do not cooperate with federal agencies with carrying out raids against workers and immigrants. All police policies must be put up for thorough public debate. Restrict cops from carrying lethal weapons at protest marches. Ban on tasers. Mandatory shoulder cameras. And do you know what? I didn't invent these ideas. It's from the ACLU. These ideas exist out there for years. What we are lacking is a political backbone in the city government to actually push for these ideas and say we need to do this now. And as I said, we have to address the question of affordable housing, which we're going to talk about, because that has a lot to do with income segregation. And I would say another start would be to get a little more diversity on the city government.
All right, now, are there any chairs available? I thought I saw one. No, there is not. One chair. Does anyone have a chair available? You see one? If you do, raise your hand, so that somebody can take that seat, and we want you to sit down if you can. And there's some people, you can sit on this, I guess you could sit on this heating, cooling thing up there. About 3 people could move forward over here and sit down. Okay. Now we're going to shift from the environment, sustainability, from race and policing to affordability, matters of inequality, and housing. In a country in which the top 400 people make more than 150 million Americans, Seattle also, in that context, Seattle also has issues of inequality. Recently, the Seattle Times featured a report which showed Seattle in the past years had the fastest growing rent in the country. What would you do to address this problem? And we want to start with Professor Sawant.
So I have to start by saying, as an immigrant from a poor country, the thing that strikes you the most is how wealthy this country is and yet faces such deep problems of inequality and and not just inequality in general, but on such basic issues as housing. Housing should be a human right, and affordability is a key human right issue. But what we see in this wealthy city of ours is a real crisis of affordable housing. It's important, I'm going to go into my economist mode here for a second, because there's this common perception that the lack of affordable housing is because of mismatch between supply and demand, and we need to build more housing units. Of course, that's entirely true. Of course, we need to build more housing because more people are moving into the city. But if you look at what's happening to housing, we see over 30,000 units being built all over around us, but a very small proportion of those accessible to most people, because the rents and the prices are set at a level where the majority of people can't afford, especially if you take into account the fact that their wages are so low. So it's a combination of skyrocketing rent and low wages. And in reality, when we talk about supply and demand, we have to recognize that demand, as defined by economics of capitalism, is not simply a desire to buy something, it's the ability to afford that good. And what we have here is two cities. We're building, the city government is catering to one city, which is full of people who are able to afford the high rent units, and the other city that does not have the ability to afford it. And that is why we are recommending rent control as one part of a comprehensive affordable housing program, in order to bring rent control within the realms of the overall cost of living, so that people can actually afford to live in the homes where they work in the city, instead of living 2 or 3 bus transfers away. And I'll talk more.
So Seattle is suffering from the problems of prosperity in housing. If you want to get really cheap rent, there are a lot of cities around this country where you can get really cheap rent because they're not doing well. The fact is that we have lots of jobs, we have lots of opportunities for people, and people are wanting to move to Seattle because it's such a great city. And we're happy to have them here, but we must have more housing. And that's the key strategy that we have to do. We need to put more housing in place by zoning for additional housing particularly around transit stops and transit stations. We need to encourage people to actually get through the construction process, get the permits going, make sure that people actually have the opportunity to create more housing. And we need to help people be able to afford that housing through a whole series of tools that we can put in place. One of them is transit, because the fact is that if you have good transit, people can afford to live in housing that actually costs a little bit more than otherwise they would be able to afford. If they don't have to spend as much of their money on their vehicle and on travel, then they will actually be able to afford more housing. So that's a key strategy. And putting housing around our light rail stations and other transit lines is one of the most important ways in which we can get more affordable housing, as I mentioned in terms of the Capitol Hill station area agreement. We also have a low-income housing levy. We have significantly increased the amount of low-income housing in this city over the last couple of decades as a result of the fact that the voters of this city, it's truly extraordinary. We have great voters in this city. They have voted to tax themselves to build low-income housing that most of them will never use. And they're actually, this is an extraordinary commitment on the part of the people of Seattle. Finally, we need to have a combination of things that are going to actually produce more affordable housing within the housing that's being built. Incentive zoning programs. I actually got the first bonus program passed in the city 10 years ago. I introduced in South Lake Union at a time when the bonus program provided zero incentive housing under the old zoning. In the new zoning, we introduced the first program that actually provided for requirements for affordable housing in that project. We have a multifamily tax exemption that's helping to create affordable housing in other communities. There are lots of other tools we can use. There is no single way in which you can address the affordable housing issue. It has to be a whole variety of ways.
So, yes, it's true that the city is doing well compared to cities like Detroit, but that's like, I don't know, comparing it to the bottom of the bottom and saying that we're doing great here. The question is, what can be made possible given the extreme wealth in this city? And it's true that the city is doing well, but what Mr. Conlin forgot to point out is that it's doing well because tens of thousands of workers are doing the work of making this city run every day and are getting very little out of it in terms of wages or housing. The definition of affordable housing that the city often uses is, 80% of the median income. That's a completely ridiculous definition. It has to come much lower. And as far as the South Lake Union, rezone that Mr. Conlin is talking about, that, the in lieu of fees were 0, and then they got it up to 21. Do you know what it is in San Francisco? It's $300 per square foot. Compare what he's offering to what is possible. And that is why here, it's our job. It's not so much about him, it's about us. Are we going to open our eyes and understand what is actually possible? If you think rent control is too socialist, fine. Why aren't you doing things that other comparable cities have, which is development impact fees, inclusionary zoning, and higher fees like cities like San Francisco and New York City? And as far as the housing levy is concerned, we are fully in support of that, but we don't think it should be paid for by regressive taxation. It should be paid for by taxing corporations and the wealthy. And the multifamily tax exemption that he's talking about, that gave $66 million in tax breaks to developers, which exceeded the amount of the 2009 housing levy. So again, it's a question of looking at what can be possible as opposed to what is on offer and making what is possible for ourselves.
I would just challenge anybody who knows anything about San Francisco to tell me that San Francisco is a model for affordable housing. People in San Francisco are paying 70% of their income in many cases for their rent. Whatever San Francisco is doing, it's not working, and we should not be taking them as a model. We need to develop something that's specific to Seattle. And specific to Seattle is really the way in which we can get people housing, and by doing all of the things that are possible in Seattle. Incentive zoning needs to continue to be expanded. We have lots of other opportunities and things that we can do to actually change it and make things better in Seattle and make more housing. But the bottom line is, unless we have more housing that's being developed, we can't achieve most of the goals that we're looking for. And one of the great models that we have in this city is the redevelopment of our low-income housing communities. Yesler Terrace is about to be redeveloped. We've already completed Rainier Vista, High Point, and New Holly. And in all of those cases, we dramatically increased the amount of housing that was present in those communities. We replaced every single low-income housing unit and added low-income housing units. Finally, I just want to say that the 80% affordable housing standard is not a city policy. That is state and federal law. We actually look at it in two terms. There's workforce housing, which are people in the 60 to 80% range, and then there are people who are below that, who are in the 30 to 50% range. That's very low-income housing. We need to provide both. And you can't have a strategy that focuses on just one of them.
We want to ask Councilperson Conlin if you now ask a question of Professor Sawant.
Well, as you probably know, CNEC, the political arm of the LGBTQ community, has not only given me an AAAA rating, the highest rating possible, but an endorsement. And I'm the only person not from the community who's been endorsed by them in this election. That's because of my long track record of successful achievement on behalf of the LGBTQ community. So I just want to ask if you'd like to talk about the things that you've done in the LGBTQ community.
First of all, I would say that as far as somebody's endorsement, some association's endorsement, or what people said about you, I feel that one thing that should be pointed out is that if you've served on the council for 16 years, and if you've really done well by ordinary people and by the concerns of the community, then you shouldn't need to rattle off a list of people who have endorsed you. I could also do that. There is a long list of organizations and individuals who have endorsed our campaign, but we want people to judge candidates on the basis of what they have done in reality. And as far as LGBTQ community is concerned, I think first of all it's important to recognize that it is not any one person's great work that has achieved LGBTQ rights so far. In reality, it has been a process of struggle and activism, starting with the Stonewall Rebellion right up to marriage equality that has been achieved last year in many states. And this is a collective effort. And it would be dishonest of me to stand here and tout my individual achievements. And so I want to talk about the initiatives and process or a protest that I have been part of in order to push forward the questions that particularly affect the LGBT community. When the National Equality March happened earlier during the Obama administration, out of the sheer disappointment and anger of the LGBT community that their needs were not being addressed in a way that they wanted it to be addressed, the National Equality March was organized in Washington. In Seattle, we had a Solidarity March, and that was a hugely important event. You know, protests are not simply symbolic. Protest movements, especially if they are large and energetic, bring out the community from their atomized units of social justice into a collective unit of social justice, and that is what moves mountains in terms of these issues. And I was part of the coalition as part of Socialist Alternative. I was representing Socialist Alternative in that coalition in order to make that possible, and that was a wonderfully satisfying experience. And as far as LGBT community is concerned, we also need to recognize that they are some of the most overrepresented in poverty, in inequality, in homelessness, in child abuse, in domestic abuse situations. And we need to support them in those things. And that implies that we need leaders on the city council who are not only going to pay lip service to these issues, but are going to fight for full funding of these programs, and that will inevitably require the willingness to tax the wealthy.
So it's funny that Ms. Sawant would poo-poo endorsements, and she goes after them as eagerly as she can. But the fact is, the reason why people go after endorsements is because you don't have to believe me, and you don't have to believe her. You can believe organizations that look at our record and say, yeah, this person has actually accomplished something. That's why I'm proud of my endorsement by CMEC, and that's why I'm proud of all the many other endorsements I have in this community, from the Sierra Club, to the Washington Conservation Voters, to the King County Labor Council, to the SEIU Local 775 and 925, lots of folks, the King County Democrats. There are literally dozens of organizations and hundreds of individuals who have given me endorsements, and that's an indication that they value what I've done. You don't have to just believe me. Let me just say a couple things I've done in the LGBTQ community. I sponsored the legislation that provided for a private right of action so that people wouldn't have to depend just on city or state action to protect their rights when they were threatened with discrimination. I sponsored legislation that that extended our prohibition on discrimination in employment to all businesses, to small businesses, not just the large ones that were previously covered. And most recently, in June of this year, as a member of the board of directors of the National League of Cities, I got the National League of Cities, which represents 17,000 cities around this country, from places like rural Minnesota and Mississippi and Arizona, to endorse marriage equality. That was a pretty extraordinary achievement. It took us months to get the board to that standpoint. And the fact that we now have cities from around the country saying marriage equality should be embraced is an extraordinary victory. And those are the kind of things that earned me the endorsement of CNEC.
I've been fighting for $15 an hour since last year. As the stranger said, since before it became cool. Fast food workers in Seattle and other major cities are also demanding $15 an hour. There is a ballot initiative for $15 an hour in the city of SeaTac. As a city council member, you are paid around $120,000 a year. You have said that you do not support $15 an hour. Can you explain how a family can live in Seattle on less than $15 an hour?
Woo! Thank you for that question. I actually never said that I didn't support $15 an hour. What I said is we need to design a path that's going to take us towards a higher minimum wage. Ideally, that path would be on the state or regional level. We can get them to act. We probably can't, so we are going to have to take some action on the city level. And so that strategy is going to be to bring people together, to find a way to identify where it is that we can move it most effectively, what the right number is, whether it's $15 an hour. You know, Senator Warren says that it should be $22 an hour. So there are lots of opportunities for us to think about expanding this. And the fact is that That's the reason why SEIU 775, who are the people who came up with the $15 an hour initiative and are sponsoring the initiative in CTAC, have given me their endorsement. Because they know that I understand how to make things happen for working people in the city. I understand that you have to have partnerships. You can't just go out and do things entirely on your own. You have to be able to involve people and engage the entire community in making these kinds of decisions. That's why if you look at the CTAC initiative, for example, they targeted it very carefully so that it actually focuses on the hotel and restaurant industry around the airport, because they realized that that was an area where, in fact, these people were in basically a captive market. They're not going to be, businesses are not going to be able to move out. And they're also a situation where these people have the resources and the opportunities to be able to afford to pay their workers. And they felt this was a great pilot in which they could try it and see what would happen. We have that opportunity in Seattle. We're going to work with SEIU and we're going to develop a strategy, and we'll go as far as we can. And I think that's the position that's been adopted by just about all of the people who are running for office, including the both mayoral candidates.
As far as whether he said he does not support, there is a video that shows that he said that. He stood right next to me and said that. But, that's less important. The more important thing are the political points, which is that, the fact that for years, people like him have been in city government, never talked about increasing wages. And now he's quoting Elizabeth Warren and saying that she's asking for $22 an hour. That's disingenuous of him. You're not even fighting for $15 an hour. Why are you trying to talk about $22 an hour? That's like, trying to fool people. Do you think people are that stupid that they don't understand that you're not even fighting for something less than that? You have said that $15 an hour is pie in the sky. And yes, it is pie in the sky if you have a leadership that will not fight for you. But it's not pie in the sky given how urgently it is necessary for people, and it won't be pie in the sky if we all fight for it together. And I agree with Mr. Conlin, we need to engage everybody, but that's exactly what we're doing. Look at how our campaign has come forward, a grassroots campaign with very few financial resources. We have over 200 volunteers working with our campaign and making sacrifices because they believe in this and because they think it's going to happen because of a mass movement that we are spearheading and the fast food movement is spearheading. And the change in the debate that has occurred with the two mayoral candidates falling over each other to support $15 an hour, that's a wonderful thing. But that did not happen automatically. That happened because we have a grassroots campaign challenging all the candidates to take a stand on this important issue, and because we have a fast food movement fighting for it.
We want to shift now to questions from the audience, but just before we do, and actually we want you to write them down. Are we done?
Well, we're pretty close.
Yeah, we're close to, well, maybe we have one question from the audience. But just before I ask it, I've got to recognize, I'm getting a lot of prominent time up here, but I was one of the lesser involved people putting this on. I want Craig Shorts to stand up because I know that he was heavily involved in putting this on, and I want Craig to let me know, come on up forward really fast, and let me know if there's anybody else that, and I know Thomas. We'll do it. You can say that, but say something.
What I want to say is that an event like this takes the participation of a lot of people, but what's more important is that we need to do a lot more of them. We need to revitalize the political culture at Seattle Central, which I think has been fairly dead for a while. This is a good step forward. It's great to have the candidates who we have here today, and we need to make sure we do something like this consistently so that we become the beacon and voice of a progressive Seattle.
Thank you.
All right, let's do this. Let's see if you can't. Let's see if we can't ask two questions rather succinctly, and then I'm going to read one of these questions. This is really unfair to the candidates, and then ask them to kind of respond to these three questions at once. So, Don't do it, you gotta go?
Really, I was told this would be over 11:50 and I've got.
I got it. All right.
I'm sorry.
We're gonna have to finish because we gotta make a fair commitment to those involved. Can we give a big round of applause to our